The music was loud, the summer air was thick with the smell of charbroiled burgers and cheap champagne, and I stood near the edge of the patio, trying to look like I belonged at my own graduation party. That was the first mistake. The second came when my stepmom, Laura, decided to turn my achievement into her main stage. She stood right in the center of the backyard, a spotlight blonde in a white linen dress, and tapped a silver spoon against her glass until the synthetic chatter died down. She raised the glass high and smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, and announced to the entire backyard, "We are moving without you." The silence that followed was so immediate and absolute it felt like a collective punch to the stomach. Every head turned toward me. Eva, the girl who had just spent 4 years working two part-time jobs while earning a degree no one in this family seemed to value. Laura let the silence hang, sharp and waited, before adding the final, precise cut. "This house," she declared, sweeping her manicured hand over the carefully tended lawn, "is simply too good for someone like you." Then the laughter started. It was thin and sharp at first, driven by her immediate circle of friends, and then it spread, fueled by confusion and the sheer awkwardness of the moment. It burned hotter and deeper than the sun beating down on the patio. I watched Grant, my father, standing beside her. He blinked hard and focused on the deck boards beneath his feet, looking exactly as he always did when Laura delivered a blow absent. He had mastered the art of passive neglect years ago, leaving me to orbit on the fringes of his life while she cemented her gravity. The humiliation was a familiar coat, threadbare and uncomfortable, but I didn't flinch. I felt a quiet, internal click, a lock turning, and the heat of shame was instantly replaced by cold, focused clarity. They expected tears, a plea, a scene worthy of their cruelty. I wouldn't give it to them. I just met Laura's gaze, let the laughter wash over me, and said, my voice perfectly level, "Have a safe move." What she didn't know was simple. What none of them knew was that I'd secretly bought the house last month. The next day, eviction notices would arrive. I spent the next hour moving like a ghost through my own party, helping myself to a piece of the chocolate cake I'd helped bake earlier that morning, my expression unreadable. I watched Laura hold court, reenacting the scene for her friends with dramatic whispers and exaggerated hand gestures. I saw my step-siblings high-five each other near the grill, joking about finally getting their space back. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was a coordinated, public execution of a narrative they had written years ago. Eva is temporary. Eva is disposable. The realization settled deep in my bones. This was the end of hoping. I had always hoped my father would look at me the way he used to, or that Laura would drop the performance long enough to see me. I hoped that moment of graduation, of my academic success, would change the story. It hadn't. It had merely provided the stage for my public dismissal. That quiet conviction, that realization that they had absolutely no idea what I was capable of, what I had already done in silence, was a strength unlike anything I had ever felt. It stopped being about their cruelty and started being about my choice. My hands, which had spent countless hours cleaning up after their parties and setting their tables, were steady. They had given me a choice: shrink or strike. I chose to strike, not with violence or yelling, but with the quiet, irrefutable power of a legal deed. The house, which they claimed was too good for someone like me, was already mine, and tomorrow the truth would arrive, precisely timed and legally enforced. I just had to make it through. the rest of the night. The cold wave of Laura's announcement had just hit, but the chill of the past was far more familiar. That final, public cut was merely the last layer of paint on a canvas of 10 years of subtle, relentless, emotional erasure. I often thought about the time my father, Grant, remarried when I was 12. That day didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a boundary being drawn, one I was always on the wrong side of. From the moment Laura Sterling stepped through the front door, the atmosphere of our home, a place once defined by the quiet hum of my father's workshop and the smell of my mother's favorite vanilla candles, shifted. Laura moved with the assurance of someone who believed the world and everything in it was hers by birthright. That included my father, the beautiful old house, and most crucially, the narrative of who I was allowed to be within those walls. My survival strategy developed early. I learned to minimize my space, to occupy corners, and to speak only when necessary. Silence became my armor. Any presence I exerted had to be justified, and even then, it was quickly invalidated. If I dared to sit in the living room too long, reading a book, Laura would inevitably enter with the vacuum, meticulously running the noisy machine around my feet until I gave up and retreated. If I spent hours cooking a complex dinner for the family, the moment I stepped away to pour a drink, she would swoop in, adjust the seasoning, and then accept all compliments as if she were the sole architect of the meal. None of it was loud. None of it was scream-worthy. It was all deliberate, designed to make me feel like a temporary, poorly placed piece of furniture she couldn't wait to replace. My father, Grant, never confronted it. He simply drifted into her gravity, becoming a secondary character in his own home. I watched him trade his backbone for domestic peace, leaving me to fend for myself in the emotional cold. His passivity was a deeper, more lasting wound than Laura's cruelty. The house became her stage, filled with curated memories that conveniently excluded me, large photos of her children's graduations, vacation souvenirs from trips I was never invited on, and birthday parties I watched unfold from the shadowy silence of the staircase. But I stayed. I studied harder, achieving near-perfect grades. I worked part-time after school and all through my college applications, saving every penny I earned. I built a quiet, internal resilience that none of them ever noticed, because they weren't looking. They only saw the quiet girl who always helped with the dishes and never made trouble. The only person who truly saw Eva was Eliza, my grandmother, who lived across town. Her tiny, immaculate place always smelled like warm apples and lavender detergent. She kept a small wooden table by the window, set specifically for our tea and conversations. Whenever the air at home grew too heavy and choked with Laura's unspoken expectations, I would escape there. "You don't need to shout to be powerful, Eva," Eliza told me once, her hand resting gently on mine. Some storms form in silence. I carried those words like a shield. They were my justification for the long nights studying at the kitchen table. The rest of the house slept, ignoring the subtle ways Laura tried to shrink me. She hated when I succeeded. It meant her version of me, the quiet, easily dismissed girl, didn't stick. When the opportunity arose months ago, when the previous owner of this very house needed a quick, discreet sale, I didn't hesitate. I used every cent I'd saved over 10 years, leveraging my future earnings, and seized it. I didn't tell a soul. I didn't want their opinions. And I certainly didn't want Laura's sabotage. That silence, my lifelong defense, had become the foundation of my greatest strategic move. The party last night was supposed to be a culmination of my hard work. Instead, it was simply the stage for the final act of emotional warfare. Standing there, watching Grant stare at the floor and seeing Laura's smug triumph, I realized I had been waiting 10 years for an apology that would never come. That was the moment I stopped waiting for them to change their story and decided, with cold, quiet certainty, to change the setting instead. The house was not too good for me. It was already mine. I stepped away from the crowd, their laughter still ringing in the air, but the sound had lost its power. I had a different sound to listen to now, the quiet rustle of paper. My exit was silent and unnoticed, a skill honed over years of trying to be invisible in a house that always seemed too full of Laura's presence. The shock and cold fury I felt outside dissolved as soon as I entered the main hall, leaving behind only a hard, focused certainty. Inside, the house was strangely still, the air thick with the residue of their performance. I moved through the quiet toward the staircase. Grant's voice, low and hesitant, stopped me near the kitchen counter. "Eva, are you okay?" he asked. I kept my back to him, letting the cool surface of the marble countertop ground me. I didn't need to look at him to know his expression. Worried about appearances? Worried about how his wife might spin this later, worried about the uncomfortable truth of his own cowardice. He didn't sound sorry for what had happened, only worried about the ripple effects. I didn't turn. I couldn't give him the comfort he hadn't earned or the dramatic scene he was likely bracing for. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice even and entirely lacking in the expected emotion. "You should enjoy the rest of the night." There was a long pause, filled only by the distant, muffled sound of Laura's voice outside. Then I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, an audible confirmation that he had chosen avoidance. Once again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That was the last moment I felt any hesitation or doubt. I walked upstairs to my room, the one space in the house Laura had never bothered to decorate. She hadn't needed to. She assumed I wouldn't stay long, that I was a temporary fixture waiting to be discarded. Because of her neglect, the room had remained untouched, a blank canvas that became my private sanctuary. A single lamp cast a warm, necessary circle of light on the desk where I had spent months planning my future in meticulous detail. On that desk sat a simple, thick manila file folder. It wasn't a sentimental keepsake or a scrapbook of memories. It held documents, solid and undeniable, real estate contracts, payment confirmations, and the proof that I had already stepped into adulthood on my own terms. I sat down and reopened the folder, running my fingers over the edges of the deed, the legal language a beautiful, quiet melody to my ears. I had saved and worked for years, pouring my earnings into a single, massive investment that no one knew about. Buying the house hadn't been a revenge plan originally, it had simply been an act of survival, a way to ensure I had a foundation, a safe place to land. I had seized the opportunity when the previous owner needed a quick sale. My silence, the constant shield I carried, had allowed me to execute the entire transaction without detection. I hadn't planned to use the eviction notices so quickly, or certainly not in response to my own graduation party. But Laura's calculated cruelty had accelerated things. It had clarified the situation into something binary: stay small and suffer, or use the power I had quietly accrued. I reviewed the final documents, including the notice templates I had researched late at night while the family slept. They were clean, lawful, and perfectly straightforward, demanding compliance with the law, not emotional subservience. Tomorrow would require no yelling, no accusations, and no begging. Just the silent enforcement of a legal boundary. I stood and looked around the room one last time. Every corner carried a memory of being overlooked, of being corrected, or being made to feel small, but none of that mattered anymore. Not after tonight. The pain had been transmuted into this quiet, heavy certainty. I gathered the documents, placed them neatly into a single, clean envelope, and stepped out of the room. The story of my life in this house was over, and the first chapter of my ownership was about to begin. I needed to see them one last time, to watch the performance from behind the curtain, knowing I was the stage manager. Slipping back downstairs was easy. When you spend years trying not to be noticed, you become proficient at blending into the atmosphere, becoming a function of the furniture rather than a person. The party was thinning out, the last of the distant guests saying their drawn out goodbyes. But Laura was still in the spotlight. I positioned myself near the kitchen doorway, observing the scene like a scientist studying a predictable reaction. Laura stood with her two closest friends, and she was clearly reenacting her announcement for them. I could hear snatches of her voice, high and triumphant, punctuated by the friends' brittle laughter. She threw her hand up dramatically, mimicking the "too good for you" sweep, soaking up the admiration. In that moment, her face was a mask of flawless victory, confirming that the entire graduation celebration had been merely a setup for my humiliation. My chest tightened, but not with the familiar pang of hurt. It was a cold, quiet pressure, a confirmation that I was doing the right thing. There was no family here to save, only performers on a stage of their own making. I watched my siblings linger by the rapidly emptying dessert table. One of them, still laughing over Laura's announcement, nudged the other and said something low and cruel about having the house entirely to themselves now. It wasn't the words that stung, but the coordination. They hadn't just been complicit, they had been rehearsed. Their cruelty was a united, organized front. A movement caught my attention. Grant was standing alone near the glass door leading to the deck, nursing a drink. He looked heavy, his shoulders slumped not with sorrow, but with the weight of avoidance. I walked toward him slowly, drawn by the need for one final check, one last, silent assessment of the man who was supposed to protect me. He sensed my presence and slowly turned. The look in his eyes was complex, a flicker of guilt, a measure of relief that I hadn't made a scene, and deep, profound cowardice. He searched my face, not for pain, but for the answer to whether I would be a problem he would have to deal with. Laura really seems happy, I said. Keeping my tone mild and purely observational, he nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. It's a big change, Eva. A new chapter for everyone. Especially for me. I agreed. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a meaningless platitude or an explanation for his silence, but the words collapsed before they formed. That was my proof. He was incapable of genuine confrontation or apology. He would always choose the path of least resistance, which meant choosing Laura over the truth and over me. I couldn't give him the comfort of forgiveness he hadn't earned, or the dramatic plea he was likely bracing for. I simply held his gaze for a long, quiet moment, allowing the emotional distance between us to settle, thick and final. I left him there, returning inside. The final physical act of preparation was all that remained. I slipped upstairs and quickly gathered the few necessities. I had planned to take with me my college notebooks, a small box of sentimental childhood drawings, and Eliza's favorite woolen scarf she had gifted me. These were my treasures, things that actually belonged to me. I placed my packed backpack by the front door, next to the single, slim envelope containing the eviction notice and the proof of ownership. I paused, resting my hand on the envelope. My heart beat slow and steady. This was no longer about reaction. This was about action. This was about boundaries enforced not by tears or begging, but by law and quiet, hard, earned ownership. I took one last, long look through the hallway toward the backyard, where I could still hear the distant, fading sound of Laura's laughter. Soon, that sound would be gone, replaced by the profound, clean silence of a space that was finally mine. I was ready. The night passed in a focused blur, and the next morning felt unnaturally bright. The kind of sunlight that demands the truth. I woke up before my alarm, my thoughts already sharp and steady. The calmness was unnerving, a stillness that had replaced the decade of low, grade anxiety I was used to carrying. Today wasn't about revenge, which felt messy and emotional. Today was about truth, about establishing boundaries, and about demonstrating, quietly and legally, that the power they believed they held over me never actually existed. I moved through the house with a sense of purpose. I dressed simply, choosing a neutral gray dress and pulling my hair back into a tight braid. Minimalist, efficient, unassailable. This was a day for legal fact, not emotional display. I retrieved the prepared documents, the slim envelope feeling cool and heavy in my hand. Inside were the notarized copies of the deed and the eviction notices, a 30-day timeline clearly outlined, everything perfectly by the book. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. A few early joggers passed by, their footsteps rhythmic and predictable. The sprinklers flicked arcs of water across the lawns. Nothing about the scene hinted at the seismic shift about to occur inside the house. It looked like any other Tuesday morning, which only amplified the secret intensity I carried. I glanced at the kitchen clock. It was 7:50, 5 in the morning. I hadn't used a lawyer. I had handled the paperwork myself, relying on my research and my meticulous nature. I knew the exact window when Laura would be on the front porch with her first cup of coffee before she was fully dressed or guarded. At 7:50, 8 in the morning, I heard the sound of an engine idling just around the corner. At precisely 8:07 in the morning, it wasn't flashy or noticeable, just the kind of car a professional process server would drive. The man who stepped out was in his late 30s, wearing a conservative jacket and tie. He checked the address on a clipboard, then looked up and greeted me with a brief, professional nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low and matter of fact. "You ready, Eva?" I inhaled slowly, letting the oxygen fill my lungs. This was it, the moment I had planned for in secret for months. "Yes, thank you," I replied, my voice steady. He handed me a copy of the notices for verification. I scanned the headings and the dates one last time. Everything was in order, clean, lawful, straightforward. A simple statement of ownership, clearly outlining the 30-day vacate requirement. No malice, no dramatics, just the truth. "Okay," he said, replacing the copy on his clipboard. "Let's begin." We walked toward the porch. I felt a subtle spike of adrenaline, but it was controlled, channeled into focus. I was not there to yell or accuse. I was merely there to stand beside the legal action I had orchestrated. Just as the process server reached for the doorbell, the front door swung open. Laura stood there, looking annoyed and caught off guard. She was wearing a thick, terry cloth robe, her hair wrapped in large rollers, and she carried a mug of steaming coffee. She squinted against the bright morning sunlight, ready to dismiss whoever was disturbing her morning ritual. She looked confused when she saw the official looking envelope in the server's hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, shifting her weight slightly, preparing to shoot down what she assumed was a sales pitch or some kind of unwanted solicitation. "Yes, ma'am," the server replied evenly, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "These are for you." I stood still, letting the professional machinery of the law take over the confrontation. The silent storm was about to break. Just as the server's finger neared the doorbell, the door swung open, and the world they had carefully constructed began to crack. 8 in the morning, she still wore her thick, terry cloth robe, and the plastic rollers were prominent in her hair. "Can I help you?" she asked the server, her tone already dismissive, clearly preparing to send away what she assumed was a salesman or a religious canvasser. "Yes, Mom," the server replied evenly, holding out the envelope. "These are for you." Laura blinked, confused. She looked at the official envelope, then at the server's blank face. Then finally, her eyes darted to me, standing calmly a few feet behind the professional man. She frowned, unable to process my presence in this specific context. She took the envelope mechanically, her fingers brushing the crisp, legal paper. "What is this?" she demanded, shifting her weight, already annoyed at the intrusion. The server, however, had already done his job. He took one step back. "You've been served," he stated simply. He nodded once to me, utterly professional and efficient, and then turned and walked toward his dark car. The action was swift, leaving Laura isolated on the porch, holding the heavy white paper. She tore the envelope open right there, her coffee forgotten in her other hand. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines of the text, and her mouth, which had been set in a dismissive line, fell open. The blood seemed to drain from her face, leaving a sickly pale canvas. She looked up at me, the horror and disbelief in her eyes so genuine it was almost shocking. "What? This is a joke?" she stammered, shaking the paper. "Tell me this is a joke, Eva." "It's not," I said quietly, taking a step closer, my voice carrying the weight of legal finality. The sound of my voice must have alerted Grant. He appeared behind Laura, shielding his eyes against the morning light. He was wearing an old t-shirt and squinted at the dramatic scene unfolding on his porch. "What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Laura shoved the documents into his chest, her hands trembling. "Read this? Just read it?" Grant took the papers, his brow furrowed with bewilderment. He skimmed the page, and I watched the realization form slowly on his face. Uncertainty, then shock, then a sudden, sharp disbelief. "Eviction?" He murmured the word, testing the sound of it, the word foreign and impossible in the context of their perfect, curated life. "Whose name?" "Who is?" He stopped, his head snapping up. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. His eyes were wide. "Eva," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Why is your name on the deed?" The question was heavy, dropping between us like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread instantly. "Because I bought the house last month," I answered. The words were simple, factual, and irrefutable. Laura's face twisted violently. "You bought?" "No. No, you didn't. You can't. This is my house," she shrieked, her mask completely failing. "It hasn't been," I corrected gently. For several weeks. I closed the sale 2 days before you announced your move at the party. Her eyes flashed with frantic anger. You're lying! You're trying to embarrass me after last night, aren't you? This is some pathetic, petty retaliation. She was scrambling, unable to accept that I could possibly possess this level of control. She couldn't fathom that my quiet resilience was rooted in anything other than weakness. If it were revenge, Laura, I said, keeping my tone mild and steady, I would have told the entire party last night, right when you were raising your glass. But I didn't, because this has nothing to do with humiliating you. I purchased the house legally, quietly, months before you even conceived of the idea of getting rid of me. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You don't have that kind of money. You don't have the connections. You don't have control. You're right. I finished for her. I don't need your approval anymore. At that moment, the door burst open again. My step-siblings rushed out onto the porch, drawn by the raised voices, their hair messy and eyes puffy with sleep. Mom, what's going on? Tell them. Laura snapped at me, her voice ragged. Tell them what you're doing! Tell them you're kicking us out of our home! It was the final desperate attempt to turn me into the villain. But I had my truth, solid and legal, and I was finally ready to deliver it. I held his gaze, allowing the truth to drop between us like a stone into still water. Grant's eyes searched mine, flickering between the legal documents in his hand and the daughter he hadn't truly seen in years. Because I bought the house last month, I repeated. The previous owner needed a quick, discreet sale. I made the offer first. Laura began to shriek, a high, panicked sound that grated against the early morning quiet. No, you don't have that kind of money! This is some pathetic retaliation after last night. You are trying to embarrass me! You think you can challenge my authority. If it were revenge, Laura, I said, keeping my tone mild and steady, I would have told the entire party last night, right when you were raising your glass. But I didn't, because this has nothing to do with humiliating you. I paused, letting my words sink in with the weight of legal fact. I purchased the house legally, quietly, months ago. You simply didn't check the property records, did you? Her daughter, my step-sister, stepped forward, her face pale. You can't just evict us! We have lives here, things to pack, commitments. That's why the notice gives you 30 days. I replied, my voice purely procedural. Everything is by the book. It's lawful and straightforward. Grant looked down at the papers again, his confusion giving way to a sickening certainty. He finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Why didn't you tell me, Eva? A small ache tugged at my chest, but only for a fraction of a second. It was the last echo of the little girl who needed her father's approval. I chose to let the ache pass without consuming me. Would it have mattered? I asked, meeting his gaze directly. Would you have listened? Or would you have let her talk over me, dismiss me, or simply drift away like always? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The guilt settling in the deep lines of his face was his only reply. He had no defense. Laura, sensing the ground slipping out from under her feet, instantly switched tactics. Her voice softened, almost shaking with false vulnerability. Eva, sweetheart, we can talk about this. We can work something out. This doesn't have to happen. We're family. It already has, Laura, I countered gently. And it's not a punishment. It's a boundary. I delivered the final blow. quoting her own cruelty back to her. You told everyone yesterday that the house was too good for someone like me. So now, it's yours to leave. Her mask cracked completely. The false warmth vanished, replaced by raw, uncontrollable fury. You ungrateful. Little. Stop. Grant cut her off sharply. His voice wasn't loud, but it was the first time in years I'd heard it carry genuine authority, enough to make Laura freeze. He turned his attention back to me, the documents limp in his hand. Is this really your final decision? He asked. Yes, I said. And it's final. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that house. It wasn't suffocating or humiliating. It was steady, strong, and entirely mine. The weight of years of neglect and dismissal was suddenly transferred to them. Laura let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking from head to toe. So, you think you've won now? You think this makes you powerful? No, I replied calmly. I think it makes me responsible for my future, for my peace, for choosing a life where I'm not constantly belittled and treated as temporary. You can't do this to us. We have nowhere to go, she screamed, the panic now fully overtaking the rage. I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I'm doing something for myself, and I gave you 30 days, which is exactly what the law requires. My step-siblings stood huddled together, whispering frantically, their faces mirroring Laura's disbelief. Grant stared at the papers again, then at the house, then back at me. I saw the regret in his eyes, but it was too little, too late to bridge the chasm his passivity had created. As they slowly began to realize the gravity of the documents and the cold reality of my ownership, they finally began to retreat inside, the frantic energy of their defeat filling the hallway. I stood on the porch, feeling the morning sun warm my skin. The house no longer echoed with cruelty. Instead, it felt lighter, as if years of accumulated emotional tension were finally lifting from the walls. Defeated and in disbelief, Laura and my step-siblings began the hurried, chaotic process of packing. The house, once their fortress, had become a space they were desperately trying to evacuate. I stood in the doorway, watching, not with triumph or vengeance, but with profound clarity. The power had shifted, and with it, the entire atmosphere of the space. Laura continued to rail against the injustice of the law, but her voice held none of its former authority. It was thin, shaky, and impotent. Grant moved through the rooms with the heavy silence of a man facing the consequences of 10 years of inaction. He avoided my gaze, focused only on gathering the belongings he realized he had no claim to. As their bags piled onto the front porch and into the car, I realized something essential. This entire ordeal was never truly about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I didn't have to keep shrinking to fit inside someone else's narrow, toxic story. It was about defining my own space and my own worth. And as their cars finally pulled away from the driveway, carrying the weight of their resentment and confusion, the street fell quiet in a way I had never known it before. There was no shouting, no thudding footsteps on the stairs, no whispers about where I did or didn't belong. Just stillness, clean and new. I stepped back inside, letting the door close softly behind me. The scent of lavender detergent and warm apples, carried on the memory of my grandmother's house, seemed to fill the air. For the first time, the house didn't feel hostile. It felt mine. Later that afternoon, Eliza called. She had heard nothing about the scene on the porch. I hadn't told her, but she knew me better than anyone. You sound lighter than you have in years, sweetheart, she said. You finally chose yourself. I felt my throat tighten, but in a good way, a release of pressure I had carried since I was 12. I'm proud of you, Eva. Her validation was the only reward I truly needed. In the days that followed, Grant reached out a few times. Short, hesitant messages checking on my well-being. I didn't ignore him, but I didn't rush to answer, either. Healing wasn't a door I could fling open overnight. It required slow, careful construction. The relationship would need boundaries he would have to work to respect. I started the slow, therapeutic process of transformation. I painted the living room walls a soft, sunlit gold, a color I chose, not Laura. I spent an afternoon planting fresh flowers by the porch, replacing the manicured, artificial arrangement Laura insisted on. I rearranged the furniture until the space felt like a beginning instead of a battleground. A week later, I stood in the doorway of the living room. The house was quiet, sunlit, finally at peace. I looked around and understood the true meaning of Eliza's words. Silence wasn't weakness. It was the boundary that saved me. This place, once a crushing reminder of everything I lacked in their eyes, had become irrefutable proof of everything I could build on my own terms. And the space was beautiful.